I'm Daniel McDuff. I'm currently a principal researcher at Microsoft, and we have a group at Microsoft called the Human Understanding and Empathy Group, which focuses on affective computing applications. A few of the other team members in our group are shown at the bottom there, and they're collaborators on this work, including some talented interns as well, who join us typically in the summers. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the work we've been doing in bringing some insights from psychology to think about how machine learning can actually leverage some of the concepts that we as humans use in terms of emotion to learn and explore. Our group generally focuses on this mission, which is to empower people by creating technologies that promote emotional resilience and well-being. And we do work from sort of fundamental machine learning and deep learning based kind of model development, all the way through to looking at user experience, doing user studies, looking at the human component and interaction with the technology we build. So you can see a few examples here of embodied virtual agents that we're building, sensing technology that we're building, all to create systems that allow us to explore and do research around how emotionally responsive technology can improve the way that we interact with machines. The projects I'm going to explain today kind of leverage multiple parts of this research, and I see it as sort of three main components. The first is perception. So there, in most of our projects, we involve some kind of sensing of the user to understand the emotional state, whether that's through vision, through speech, through language. A modeling of the emotion in a more complex way than is observed with sort of the external behaviors. So we want to leverage insights from psychology to capture what we understand as being the perhaps experienced emotional state or the socially or perceived emotional state of the user, and then think about how applications can leverage this information to make them more intelligent. And I'm going to focus on one particular set of projects that we've been looking at, which broadly fall under this title of visceral machines. And what this captures is the idea that what happens if a machine learning system actually has some emotion mechanisms that are similar or try to mimic the ways that humans use emotion. And I think the easiest way to explain this is by thinking about how emotions are a very generalizable signal. So they are a sort of fundamental signal that we use when we interact with other people, interact with the world. We receive feedback from our autonomic nervous system, and it's a very powerful tool for helping us learn, to explore, and to understand the world and each other. And this quote from Jan LeCun very simply captures that the idea of having intelligence is really impossible without this concept of emotion. If we think about human intelligence, emotion is so fundamental to our understanding of what it means to take risks, what it means to achieve positive outcomes in a situation. And in machine learning, typically, to date, there's been huge focus on supervised learning, where we give machines very clearly defined tasks with very explicit labels about the correct or incorrect answer to those tasks, whether it's in terms of object recognition or other types of understanding. But what emotions give us typically as humans is a very generalizable cross-domain reward signal that help us gain feedback from the world. So as we interact with things in the world, we receive either positive or negative feedback in terms of how our physiological or nervous system responds to those inputs. And that's what we want to really capture here and explore that. And this is a very new area of research. So the experiments are starting off with some very simple constructs to see whether if we integrate some of these ideas into a deep learning system, whether it can improve how it learns. And this is really inspired by the human nervous system, which has many components which regulate different organs in the body. So you will notice, for instance, that if you become nervous, then your heart rate would increase, your pupils might dilate, that your body will start to change functions in order to adapt to that situation. And in almost every context, our body is we're unconsciously adapting to these different types of stimuli that we're receiving, and it's something that helps us learn about the world around us. Part of this work was inspired by a really interesting project that was done at the MIT Media Lab a couple of years ago, led by Natasha Jakes, which was looking at how generative machine learning algorithms that are able to sort of generate images could be informed by the emotional response of humans viewing those images. So what you see here is several lines of images. In each case, the top line of images is a generative network, images produced by a generative network, which was trained on sketches of different types of animals. In the first case, cats. In the next case, we have spiders or crabs. And in the third case, we have elephants or rhinoceroses. And what they did here was to train an initial model and then to show people images generated by that model and look at their facial expression responses. And if people smiled, that counted as a sort of positive social reward to the image. And if they didn't, then it was a negative reward. And then they retrained that network. And what you see in the second line of images in each case are the pictures that were drawn by the system when it had these new social rewards kind of integrated into its learning. And I think you'll agree that in most cases, these images are better. They capture the category more accurately. They're nicer to look at. They're more uniform. And it just illustrates how using some of these implicit forms of feedback that we as humans might be expressing can be used by a learning system to actually improve its model, in this case of sketching pictures. We wanted to take this a little further and think about how autonomous systems could leverage some of these emotional signals. And we took driving as a scenario. Autonomous driving is, of course, a huge topic. And what's important here is that it has very significant safety implications. We want machines that are careful, that are risk averse in these contexts, because there can be a lot of things that can go wrong. And we know that humans have physiological responses to danger. So what you see here is an example of a human heartbeat pulse signal in response to driving in a simulated environment. And at the moment at which they collide with an object or have to steer very aggressively to avoid it, what we see is both increased heart rate and also a pinching of the pulse signal, which is due to the body diverting blood flow from the extremities to the vital organs. And this is a very fundamental physiological response to danger. So what we did was to capture data from humans driving in a simulated environment and then train a neural model to mimic their physiological responses in order to be able to try to predict, given a new situation, how a human's physiological response might respond to that input or stimuli. Then we took that simulated model, which we learned, which you can see here in the red box. We combined it with some extrinsic rewards, like for instance, that crashing was a bad thing and that you wanted to be able to travel faster and further, given that you don't want to crash. So we combined these intrinsic rewards coming from the inferred physiological responses with some extrinsic rewards from the environment. And we trained essentially a reinforcement learning system. So we trained the autonomous vehicle to now navigate in the environment using these rewards. And what we found was that with the intrinsic rewards, what you see here is the length of the episode, which in this case is capturing how far or how long the vehicle was able to drive before it collided with something, before it crashed, was significantly longer when we included these intrinsic rewards. And essentially what's happening is the vehicle is learning to mimic the human physiological response such that when it gets into a situation that might cause anxiety or nervousness, it starts to change its behavior earlier than a vehicle without this modeling of the physiological response. And so that was a nice finding. And so we wanted to take that a little bit further. So in the first project, we were looking at risk aversion. We wanted the vehicle to avoid crashing with things. But that's just one aspect of exploration. And if you make a system too risk averse, its optimal policy might just be to stay stationary or to drive, but drive very slowly and not be very adventurous. So in our second project, we looked at whether we could use other signals, other feedback signals, to create a system that was more curious and able to explore larger areas and essentially have a drive for curiosity. And in this case, we modeled human expression responses, in particular looking at positive facial expressions. So again, we had humans drive in simulated environments where we captured their facial expressions. And sometimes while they were exploring in those simulated environments, they would smile, indicating a positive reward. In other cases, they wouldn't, or they might show other types of negative facial expressions. And we did a similar thing here where we trained an intrinsic reward policy based on that human data, and then gave that policy to the autonomous vehicle. And what you can see here is that when we included the positive emotion-based intrinsic reward, which is on the right-hand side, the vehicle was able to drive further or explore further than when it didn't have that reward. And our hypothesis here is that positive emotions act as a drive for us to discover things, for us to be curious. When we discover things, then we receive a positive physiological response. It's something that pleases us, that excites us. And that's what we think the algorithm is essentially capturing. Just To give you an example, we tried several different combinations of models, and what you see here is a map of the simulated environment. And on the right-hand side, the affect-based policy, the red in the heat map illustrates where the vehicle drove during some trials of the system. And you can see that significantly further than in other versions, including the sort of fairly difficult baseline, which is imitation learning, which is essentially trying to just mimic human controlling of the vehicle. So to contrast those two systems, in one case, in the first case, we had the risk-averse system where we were training with an intrinsic reward based on physiological responses, particularly fight or flight response. And in the second case, we had the curiosity-seeking policy, which was looking at positive emotion expressed by the participants, and we were mimicking those responses. And essentially, we see sort of conflicting behaviors. So the risk-averse policy crashes less frequently, so we get longer trials before collisions than with the curiosity-seeking policy. But the curiosity-seeking policy allows us to explore further than the risk-averse policy. Even though the risk-averse policy is driving for longer, it's exploring less area. And so where we are taking this next is to look at how we can combine these different signals to create something more optimal, which is a combination of risk aversity, but also curiosity seeking in order to allow the machine to explore, but to explore in a safe way. So those are examples with autonomous vehicles. I just briefly want to touch on how some of this could apply in other contexts, in particular to embodied virtual agents. And this is something we're exploring, looking at conversational systems generally, but also in the case where you're talking to a virtual human. One thing that we've found is that virtual humans that try to mimic the conversational style of another human allow us to create systems that are more natural to interact with. And you might have noticed this when you talk to other human beings. Typically, when you engage in a conversation, you might start to adapt your conversational style to match the other person, using similar types of words, speaking at a similar type of rate. And this adaptation is important for helping create social cohesion, things like that. And modeling this in the agent, we were actually able to observe that over time, as people interacted with the agent, they started to align with the style of the agent. And so we've started to develop agents that do the same thing, where we explore what happens if the agent starts to match the style of the human as well, so that they can meet in the middle rather than the human having to adapt more to the style of the agent compared to vice versa. In this case, we're looking at multimodal signals, including the rate of speech, the types of words that are used, the prosodic elements in terms of frequency components of the voice. So we're combining these different signals to do that style matching. So it's not just linguistic, it's paralinguistic as well. And we found that dialogue systems that are able to capture these signals, these emotional signals, are rated more highly overall. Not just in terms of how emotional they are, but how engaging they are, how empathetic they appear, and also how appropriate they appear, because emotion is a huge part of creating responses that seem appropriate given the circumstances. And so we're looking at this at different levels, as I mentioned, both on the dialogue level, but also in the expressivity in terms of the visual channels and the audio channels. All of this work is, has many implications for human-computer interaction, as well as AI, when we think about learning systems that leverage emotional signals. One thing I just wanted to promote was these licenses that we've started to develop, which are across company, cross-university efforts. So there are members from Google, IBM, Microsoft, Northwestern, several law firms who are helping us to develop AI licenses that allow people to distribute code and data in this domain in a way that allows you to restrict certain uses that you might feel are either not well validated given your models, or perhaps are inappropriate given the technology. And we're exploring this so that people can feel free to essentially sort of open source their code, but also have the ability to make sure that it's not misused. And I definitely encourage you to look at licenses.ai to find out more about the Responsible Licenses Initiative. And if anyone from this community, in particular the Emotion AI community, is interested in this topic, we will be rescheduling our AAAI Spring Symposium to the fall because of the current situation. And we would welcome anyone who would like to attend. And so that brings me to the end of my talk. While I answer questions, I'll play a video of an installation that we deployed in the Microsoft campus, which was visualizing some of these emotional signals that we're using in our research to allow people in the community to kind of understand and engage with some of these sensor signals. So it was visualizing emotional data through a very nicely designed architectural piece from Jenny Sabin at Cornell. But I'd be happy now to answer any questions on the research, and I'll move over to that.
All right, if you have a question for Daniel, now's the time. You can use the Q&A feature within Zoom, or you can raise your hand. In order to do that, you should see a little raise hand icon toward the bottom of your window. If you don't, you should let me know later. But in any case, do we have any questions for Daniel? I'd also welcome comments if you have any comments related to similar work that you're doing that is similar to what Daniel has presented, or ways that you think this might be applied.
So there's one question here on the chat. The question is, RE, autonomously driven vehicle research, did you experiment with autonomous cars communicating with each other? We didn't. I think that's a great question. Again, for humans, many of these sort of implicit signals we receive from humans are through facial expressions or other types of responses, which may not be, very explicit in terms of language instruction or labels, but we receive these implicit types of feedback. And I think those may become very important as we think about autonomous systems, both interacting with each other, but also interacting, of course, with humans. There's been some very interesting research, again, from the MIT Media Lab, in which they've looked at how cars could show essentially some form of facial expressions to pedestrians to indicate when they're about to act. For instance, if a pedestrian is about to cross the road, the car could look at the pedestrian using some displayed features in order to indicate that it had seen the pedestrian. So I think there's a lot of interesting things to explore there, but we hadn't. Another question is, decoding human facial expressions is highly subjective. as people express emotions with varying facial expression. I'm just wondering at how you arrived at a universal model. And to answer that, I would say we don't have a universal model. We're using relatively, I'll still say that the understanding of facial expressions is still relatively simple. There are some things that we see fairly universally in cross-cultural research that smiles indicate positive responses, but not always. For instance, you see people smile in stressful situations. So one of the reasons for using some of these implicit feedback mechanisms is that we're not relying on a very concrete interpretation of the emotion. We're using it as a subtle implicit nudging for the autonomous system. So in that case, it's somewhat sort of robust to different interpretations of the expression. But yeah, so we're not necessarily giving very explicit labels in terms of felt emotion based on facial expressions. And the third question is, can you comment on computational tractability? In terms of the autonomous vehicles examples, they were very relatively, computationally inexpensive models, because we're just trying to predict essentially one-dimensional outputs from the current environmental input. And so that was definitely possible to run easily in real time. And we typically, when we train these RL systems, we might be running in faster than real time. With the autonomous agents, the embodied virtual agents, it becomes much more important to, because we're interacting with a human live, we want the system to be very responsive, the latency to be very low, so that you can have a conversation with the system without having to wait, several seconds before it responds to what you said. And when we're putting on top of models on top of each other for neural dialogue generation, for speech synthesis, and then visual synthesis using the agent, it does become very challenging. And that's still something that we're working on, to be able to simulate more natural conversation with these agents. It's still a little bit stilted because of the delay in response that you get from the system.
Daniel, we have a couple of questions entered via the chat. We can take maybe just another couple of minutes. We have 3 there. We look at cultural differences in the future, asked Shabnam Tafreshi.
Yes, we've been doing, alongside this, we've been doing cross-cultural research. We've actually been doing some of the largest observational studies of expression across cultures. But I would still say that, much of this is very, we're really just scratching the surface in terms of analyzing how and why different facial expressions, for instance, have different base rates across different countries. And we're looking at what social factors correlate with different levels of expressivity. And there's great research looking at migration, historical heterogeneity in terms of different cultures and how that's correlated with different levels of expressivity. And as we get more observational data from around the world, we're able to do this type of research more systematically. But it's still, still a lot to explore.
And maybe take one more question. We have Lind Bacon has asked, can you say a little more about the technologies you're using to collect human physiological data, aside from HR and facial expressions, any other physiological measures?
Yes, so in certain contexts, we still will use contact sensors. For instance, if we're performing lab studies, But more and more so, we're moving to non-contact physiological measurement. And so we're using optical algorithms, so from cameras to infer heart rate, respiration, heart rate variability, and starting to explore also peripheral blood flow, so vasodilation and other signals that are in some cases more sensitive, capture sympathetic nervous system responses more sensitively. And so the advantage, of course, of non-contact measures is that we can scale more easily, but also create more comfortable and realistic scenarios, particularly, for example, in the driving scenario, we don't want to have to instrument up participants necessarily.
Right. Thanks very much, Daniel.